Hey guys, tonight, we step softly through time to where golden sands shimmer under a moon that has seen dynasties rise and fall. You're not standing in front of a museum glass case. You're right there, your sandals already filling with warm grains of wind-blown earth. Somewhere far behind you, the modern world fades to a dull hum replaced by the murmur of palm fronds, the lap of the Nile, and the distant rhythm of temple drums. Tonight, we begin peeling back the silken veils of Egypt's royal courts, but not for the pharaohs. We're heading into the corridors behind the throne, the spaces where queens, priestesses, sisters, daughters, and great wives of the king shaped empires with little more than a gesture, a glance, or a whisper. Some of them you've heard of barely. Others have been buried both literally and by history. And fair warning, if you think ancient Egypt was all glittering crowns and spa days in the afterlife, you probably won't survive this. These royal women lived lives of astonishing pressure, expected to birth heirs, hold courts, interpret omens, conduct international diplomacy, and occasionally, rule the entire kingdom, often without official recognition. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are? Drop your city and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking toward Thebes now. Not the reconstructed Thebes of tourist maps, but the real one, the one that smells like hot stone and lotus oil, where the sandstone temples of Karnak glow like embers at sunrise. Around you, the city's waking up. Boys drive herds of goats past market stalls, and servants sweep courtyards with bundled reeds. But you're not looking at them. You're looking at the walls carved with gods and men. And you notice something strange. The gods are towering, the men are proud. And the women, they're everywhere. They're not just holding babies or pouring wine. They're being crowned, holding symbols of power, standing with the gods as equals or more. See, long before Cleopatra flicked her eyeliner, royal women in Egypt had already been quietly running the show. Let's start with a name that doesn't make it into many school books, Merneith. We're talking way back, First Dynasty. You're standing before her tomb in Abydos now. It's massive. For centuries, historians weren't even sure if she was a queen or a king. Some still argue whether Merneith ruled as regent for her son or as full pharaoh. Her name appears in king lists, but not always. Her tomb has boat pits usually reserved for kings, and servants were buried with her, which, while tragic, was also a marker of high status. You feel the stones beneath your hand, sun-warmed and heavy with time. They whisper, she mattered. You move forward in time. Now you're in the Middle Kingdom. Pharaohs are still in power, but the cult of the king is changing. The afterlife is being democratized, no longer just the VIP lounge for royals. And as the theology shifts, so does the role of queens. You overhear priests debating whether queens can intercede with the gods the way kings do. Some nod solemnly, others scoff. One mutters about improper elevation of the feminine spirit. Typical. Here's something quirky and some spells from the coffin texts. It's not just the king calling upon Osiris. Sometimes it's the queen. In one version, the spirit speaking is she rising from death with a voice like thunder behind linen. Not exactly your average bedtime lullaby. As you sit beneath a tamarisk tree, you ponder how these women wielded power in ways often unrecorded. They ruled behind silk screens and perfume smoke. They influenced court decisions from garden courtyards, where they met visiting envoys with trays of wine and diplomacy. And yet most of their names have faded. That brings us to a whisper-soft reality. Historians still argue whether the lack of written records on royal women was due to genuine insignificance or a deliberate rewriting by male successors who found them inconvenient. You look to the sky where vultures circle in a lazy spiral. In ancient Egypt, the vulture wasn't just a scavenger, it was sacred. The goddess Nekhbet, patron of Upper Egypt, wore a vulture headdress, and you'll start noticing many queens do too. Not crowns, not cobras, vultures. As if to say, I see what's dead, I guard what matters, and I endure. And speaking of enduring, can we take a moment to appreciate the heat you're sweating through your linen shift, and you're not even walking uphill? Ancient Egyptian queens had to sit through ceremonies wearing pounds of gold wigs that trapped heat like clay ovens, and makeup made of powdered lead. Sure, they looked radiant. Also, probably had migraines. Still, here's a fun tidbit: some queens used crocodile dung mixed with honey as sunscreen. Why, allegedly, it worked. Or maybe it just kept people at a respectful distance. You walk past a limestone carving of a royal family pharaoh in front, and beside him the queen. She's small in scale, yes, but look at her gesture. She's reaching toward his shoulder, not from behind, but beside him. Equal. Or perhaps gently correcting his posture, your eyes close for a moment, lulled by the hiss of river reeds. In that soft place between sleep and memory, you sense the presence of Egypt's royal women, not as wives, not as shadows, but as makers of legacy. Their stories are buried, yes, but not lost. Not if you're willing to keep digging. The Nile shimmers in the morning haze as you press deeper into Egypt's royal past. The air is thick with incense and possibilities. If you listen closely beyond the bustle of priests and merchants, you can almost hear a lullaby sung in ancient Egyptian, a queen's voice soothing a future god to sleep. Tonight, you're not shadowing a single royal woman. You're witnessing a lineage of matriarchs, starting with one of the most overlooked but foundational, Tetisheri. If ancient Egypt had a grandmother figure to the empire, she'd be wearing Tetisheri's sandals. You're now standing before her monumental tomb at Abydos. Yes, a monument just for her, unusual for a queen mother. Pharaohs typically got the big limestone ego boosts. Not this time. Tetisheri wasn't just the mother of Sekenenre Tau. She was the grandmother of Amoseth Kharman, the pharaoh who finally kicked the Hyksos out of Egypt and began the 18th dynasty, arguably Egypt's most iconic dynasty ever. Think Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and yes, Nefertiti and Ankhesenamun. All descendants of Tetisheri. All walking through doors she quietly pried open. Here's the thing about Tetisheri: she wasn't born royal. She was common-born and married into power. Yet her intelligence and diplomatic sway earned her respect far beyond that of her noble-born peers. The fact that Ahmose honored her with an entire pyramid and mortuary temple speaks volumes. And if you're thinking, well, maybe he was just a doting grandson, remember, ancient Egyptians didn't build monuments for sentimental value. That limestone cost major gold. It meant something. You pass your fingers along a carved stone wall where Ahmose calls her mother of the king and God's wife of Amun. That last title, that's a big deal. It suggests that Tetisheri wasn't just a royal mom, she was part of a priestly power structure that blurred the lines between statecraft and sacred duty. Modern historians still argue whether this role granted true political agency or was more symbolic, a way of honoring queens while keeping them off the throne. But the writing is there: she held court, she gave orders, and she helped reforge a broken kingdom. Now walk forward into a chamber draped in dark blue linen. The air smells like amber resin and heated stone. You've just entered the world of Ahmose Nefertari, Tetisheri's granddaughter, and the first queen in Egyptian history, to be officially deified in her lifetime. Imagine that. A woman not only worshipped after death, but honored like a living goddess while still supervising palace staff and raising her son. Ahmose Nefertari was married to Ahmose I, yes, her brother. Not weird by royal Egyptian standards. It was actually considered a way to preserve the divine bloodline. You sigh. Families are complicated, but what isn't complicated is her impact. Ahmose Nefertari was a co-founder of Egypt's imperial future. She appears in temple inscriptions not as a passive consort, but as co-ruler. In one wall scene, she's the same height as her husband, a symbolic artistic choice since male figures were usually drawn larger. That's like someone letting you drive their Ferrari and putting your name on the title. You pause beneath her image in the Temple of Karnak. Her eyes look amused, like she knows something no one else does. Probably because she did. She controlled Theban religious politics, managed estates, and acted as high priestess in Amun's temple. And here's the fascinating fringe tidbit. Some inscriptions depict her surrounded by sacred cows, not just for fertility symbols, but because a cult formed around her in death that lasted nearly 500 years. That's right. People prayed to her as a protective ancestor. She even got her own cake offerings and incense schedules. Your great-great-great-granddaughter won't even remember your birthday, and this woman was still getting candles lit 5 centuries later. Of course, all of this begs the question, why were these women so powerful then, and so invisible now? You glance around and notice something subtle. Most ancient texts were copied, translated and studied by men for centuries. The deeds of kings got the spotlight. The whispers of queens mostly lost under sand or tucked behind cartouches. But not tonight. Tonight you're here sitting beneath the rising moon, charting how Egypt's royal women didn't just support empires. They built them, raised them, nursed them through droughts, rebellions, and crocodile plagues. Yes, real crocodile plagues. Just imagine trying to host a banquet and losing half your guests to angry reptiles in the palace pool. Welcome to Egypt. You lean over a reed boat anchored on the Nile. Below you, the water is smooth, reflecting the first stars of the night. As the boatman sings a lullaby about the goddess Hathor, you drift into the warm understanding that queens like Tetisheri and Ahmose Nefertari weren't merely supportive figures, they were architects of dynasties. And if you listen hard enough, the wind whispers back their names, not from papyrus scrolls or museum placards, but from the stones, the silt, and the hearts of a people who never truly forgot them. You step off the boat and onto polished stone warm from the day's sun, but cooling fast in the velvet dusk. Before you looms an immense colonnade, each pillar taller than a cedar tree, carved with symbols that catch the torchlight. This is Deir el-Bahari, and you're about to meet someone who didn't just bend tradition, she snapped it in half, rewrote the rules, and dared Egypt to catch up. Her name, Hatshepsut. Her title, Pharaoh. Not queen, not great wife, not regent. Pharaoh. You walk through the temple, built in her name, terraced, geometric, elegant, in a way that feels almost modern. Even now, centuries later, it stands proud against the cliffs of western Thebes. You're not here for dusty relics. You're here to understand how a royal woman became a god-king in a culture obsessed with lineage and divine order. Let's back up. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose I and married her half-brother Thutmose II. When he died, she was supposed to rule as regent for her infant stepson Thutmose III. You know, warm the throne, fluff the pillows, keep things tidy. But Hatshepsut had other plans. She didn't just hang around the court. She declared herself pharaoh, donned the royal kilt, the false beard, and took on male pronouns in inscriptions. Artists were ordered to depict her as a man, not as a denial of her womanhood, but to align with the iconography of kingship. Imagine the audacity and the paperwork. Now, historians still argue whether Hatshepsut seized power unjustly or stepped in to save a wobbly kingdom. Some say she sidelined Thutmose III out of ambition. Others believe she ruled alongside him, gently guiding until he came of age. There's no consensus. But what's clear is this: Egypt prospered under her rule. Trade routes reopened, temples flourished, art reached exquisite heights. You feel it as you run your fingers along the reliefs showing her expedition to Punt, an exotic land of gold incense trees and baboons. Yes, baboons. She brought them back like diplomatic souvenirs. Your local customs office would not approve. Here's a quirky tidbit: some of those incense trees. She planted them at her temple. Real myrrh trees grown on Egyptian soil, a kind of living museum exhibit thousands of years before botanical gardens were a thing. You stand beneath a scene showing Hatshepsut's divine birth, in which the god Amun himself impregnates her mother in a dream. Propaganda, definitely. Effective, also definitely. It's the ancient Egyptian version of God made me do it, and people bought it. Still, not everyone clapped politely. After her death, someone, probably Thutmose III, attempted to erase her. Statues were smashed, her name chiseled off monuments, her memory scrubbed like a state-sponsored social media purge. For centuries, she was nearly lost, but not entirely. Stone remembers, and so does sand. You walk into a small chamber away from the grandeur and notice a painted wall where Hatshepsut appears, as herself. Not a god, not a man, just a woman with soft eyes and the weight of centuries on her shoulders. She stares across time with a half-smile, like she knows you're here and approves. A breeze rustles through the columns. You imagine the young Hatshepsut as a girl in the palace, watching her father hold court, learning the way words become laws and rituals shape empires. Was she already planning her future? Or did the future fall into her lap like a snake in a basket, dangerous, inevitable, and needing to be tamed as the moonlight filters across her statues, still standing tall despite all attempts to topple her? You realize something else: Hatshepsut didn't just rule as a man to gain power. She redefined what it meant to rule, full stop. And the people, by all evidence, didn't revolt. No uprisings, no angry priestly petitions, just a flourishing Egypt. Maybe it's because in a society where cosmic order mattered more than gender, the gods seemed unbothered by who sat on the throne, as long as they upheld Mayat, the divine balance. And Hatshepsut, she was a master of balance. Not just in politics, but in art, faith, legacy. You walk back toward the entrance of her temple. The path glows faintly in the night, scattered with fragments of broken carvings and wind-blown petals. You pause, placing a hand on one cool slab of limestone. It vibrates slightly, not with sound, but with presence. You've heard the stories of kings who won wars, conquered nations, raised obelisks, and demanded to be remembered forever. But Hatshepsut, she just became eternal quietly. The stone beneath your feet shifts from polished temple floors to the uneven flagstones of a royal garden, hidden behind high mud brick walls and shaded by fig trees. The air here is different. It smells less like incense and more like roses, crushed mint, and something smoky. You've wandered into the harem gardens, and tonight you'll learn that power in Egypt didn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wore perfume. Welcome to the world of royal concubines, court favorites, and the unseen forces behind the throne. If you imagined the Egyptian palace as a linear chain of command pharaoh on top, then priests, generals, and scribes guess again. The real power often flowed sideways, whispered, shared in glances over wine or encoded in scented letters carried between courtyards. You pause beneath a trellis draped in blue lotus flowers. A group of women sits in a tiled courtyard nearby, some playing music on lutes, others gossiping, laughing, or quietly watching. Don't let the soft linen and golden bangles fool you. These women are dangerous in the same way that a perfectly carved dagger is dangerous. Many of them aren't Egyptian. They've been brought from foreign courts as political offerings. Others were born here, daughters of nobles or high-ranking officials, carefully trained in etiquette, poetry, and charm. They're not wives, not officially, but their roles can shape dynasties. Let's talk about one such woman, Kia. You won't find her name chiseled into a pyramid. In fact, most of it has been erased. But for a brief window during Akhenaten's reign, she glowed bright enough to earn her own sun disk. Her name appears on wine jars and in talatat blocks, those small sandstone panels Akhenaten used in his capital at Amarna. Historians still argue whether Kia was Akhenaten's true love, a favored foreign concubine, or the mother of Tutankhamun. The evidence is murky, but here's the tea: her image once stood beside the king's, where Nefertiti's used to be. And then poof, replaced, scrubbed out. One theory, Nefertiti grew jealous. Another, Kia fell from grace. A third, she died in childbirth, and Nefertiti took over as co-regent, possibly even as pharaoh. Whatever the case, Kia's brief flash of visibility hints at how concubines could rise and fall faster than the Nile flood. And it wasn't just about who shared the king's bed. In a society obsessed with heirs, the ability to bear royal sons was political currency. You peek around a carved screen where a nurse rocks a baby wrapped in fine linen. That child might be the next ruler, or an unfortunate accident the court pretends never existed. Here's a quirky tidbit for you: some concubines wore amulets shaped like frogs. Not for fashion. Frogs symbolized fertility. The more frog bling you had, the more you were basically announcing, "I'm ready to make heirs. Let's go." Imagine Tinder bios written in hieroglyphs. Now let's be honest. The harem wasn't always a gilded sanctuary. It could be a prison. Jealousy thrived here. So did surveillance. Women were sometimes spied on by eunuchs or palace guards. And betrayal, oh, it happened. One of the most infamous incidents in Egyptian royal history involves a harem conspiracy. During the reign of Ramesses III, members of his harem, including a lesser wife named Tiye, plotted to kill the king and install her son as pharaoh. Let that sink in. The queen mother of a secondary line almost pulled off a palace coup from behind scented screens and whispered plans. You peek down a corridor lit by flickering oil lamps. Imagine Tiye slipping past guards at night, delivering secret scrolls, bribing scribes, coordinating assassins, all while smiling politely at court banquets. The plot was discovered eventually. The trial was massive. Dozens were executed, including nobles, guards, and conspirators. Some were ordered to commit suicide. Others were burned alive, a rare and extreme punishment in Egypt. And Tiye, her fate isn't fully known. Historians still argue whether she was executed, exiled, or allowed to die in shameful obscurity. You sip from a cup of diluted wine someone hands you, bitter, spiced, and unexpectedly cold. It wakes you up just enough to realize how little separates affection from ambition in a palace like this. The women here learn the rhythms of power early: who to flatter, who to avoid, when to speak, when to fall silent, when to cry, and when to pretend. And behind them, servants, nurses, and midwives who remember everything and say nothing. You pass a fountain where two older women are massaging scented oil into the shoulders of a younger girl, perhaps new to the harem, perhaps destined to be forgotten, or perhaps the next mother of Egypt's future. No one knows yet. That's the thrill. That's the danger. The petals of court life seem delicate, even lovely. But you now understand they float on a pool of rivalry, risk, and royal blood. And somewhere just beyond that trellis, a woman is practicing her smile in a polished copper mirror, readying herself for the next time the king walks by. The sun is lower now, casting long shadows across the palace floor, and you're led through a hall lined with papyrus-shaped columns. Your sandals whisper on the polished flagstones as you enter a space quieter than the rest. There's no music here, no gossiping courtiers. Just the echo of power, the kind that doesn't need to shout. You've just stepped into the private world of Queen Tia, and trust me, you're in the presence of someone who changed Egypt forever, even if you don't immediately see her name carved into every wall. Tia wasn't born a queen. She wasn't even of royal blood. Her father Yuya was a powerful official, possibly of foreign origin, and her mother Thuya held high religious titles. That background alone gave her status, but not the kind that guaranteed proximity to a pharaoh. And yet Tia married Amenhotep III, one of the most powerful kings in Egyptian history. And she didn't just marry him, she became his equal. You're now standing before a painted relief, where Tia and Amenhotep sit side by side, equal height, equal throne, equal poise. She wears a vulture headdress and a cobra on her forehead, symbols usually reserved for goddesses and kings. Her name appears not as a mere great wife, but as Tia, who fills the heart of the king. Not bad for someone without a drop of royal blood. You imagine her seated in her private chambers, deciding how to respond to a letter from a foreign king who dared question her husband's loyalty. Yes, because foreign rulers wrote directly to her. She wasn't just visible in the court. She was recognized internationally. One famous letter from the king of Mitanni refers to her as someone wise like a goddess. High praise even by ancient PR standards. And here's the kicker, Amenhotep III built a man-made lake just for her. Forget jewelry, he gave her water, in the desert. As you step through another archway, the scent of myrrh and cinnamon fills the air. This part of the palace is lined with artifacts, now fragments connected to Tia. Jewelry inscribed with her cartouche. A chair with gold inlay shaped like wings. A tiny box of coal still faintly blackened. But these objects whisper more than luxury. They tell the story of a woman who stayed in power across 2 reigns. When Amenhotep III died, Tia didn't retreat into the shadows like many queen mothers. She became a stabilizing force during her son's reign, Akhenaten, the radical pharaoh who tried to change Egypt's religion and capital city all at once. You remember him, right? Guy with the weird elongated statues, sun disk, obsession, and a penchant for making everyone very uncomfortable. Well, it was Tia who stayed by his side in Amarna, the new city he built for the Aten. She's even depicted there sitting at banquets, playing a clear advisory role, while the rest of the royal family awkwardly hugs each other in those famously odd reliefs. Historians still argue whether Tia supported Akhenaten's religious reforms or simply tolerated them to preserve political balance. Either way, her continued presence signals one thing: her authority outlived her husband's. And here's a quirky nugget: Tia may be the first queen in history whose image appeared with realistic signs of aging. Let that sink in. In a world obsessed with divine beauty, Tia was shown with wrinkles, not as a flaw, but as a sign of wisdom. The nerve, the grace. You step into the cool dimness of a side room where a reconstructed shrine once stood in her honor. No towering statues here, just intimacy. The kind of space where real decisions are made, and the kind of quiet where secrets take shape. You picture her negotiating alliances, calming the court, shielding her grandchildren from palace plots, maybe even slipping coded messages to Nefertiti. Oh yes, we'll get to her. And yet, despite her massive influence, Tiye's tomb has never been found with certainty. There's a mummified woman in KV-35, her long hair still intact, believed by many to be her. But without definitive inscriptions, we can't say for sure. Even in death, she remains strategic. You glance up at the painted ceiling. Stars drift across it in indigo and gold constellations spinning above your head, like gossip in the palace halls. You wonder what Tiye would think of her legacy, half-remembered, half-guessed, completely remarkable. Would she smirk at how little we know? Or would she be pleased that her story, once reduced to footnotes, now glows brighter with each new discovery? You walk back through her world, past lotus-shaped capitals and cracked tiles. The silence here isn't empty, it's full. Full of decisions made, letters sent, kings influenced, and empires subtly nudged by a woman whose greatest power may have been her presence, calm, commanding, and permanent as the Nile. The hallway narrows now. The air shifts. The scent of warm stone gives way to crushed rose petals, aged resin, and something metallic beneath it all, like old bronze or buried truth. You step into a gallery filled with tall, elegant forms painted in sunset colors, gold, crimson, ochre. At the center of it, all standing straight-backed and unflinching in every depiction, is Nefertiti. Ah, yes. The face that launched 1,000 museum gift shops. But tonight, you're not here to marvel at her bust. Tonight, you're here to strip away the limestone smoothness and discover the woman behind the myth, who she was, what she did, and why her legacy may be far more powerful than the fragment she left behind. She enters history like a whisper as the great royal wife of Akhenaten. But even from the start, she's not just with him. She is everywhere. Depicted in temples, making offerings, driving chariots, even smashing enemies. Not normal queen stuff. That's king territory. You glance at one relief, showing her towering nearly as tall as Akhenaten's arm, outstretched, anointing him with oil. She's not supporting him, she's equal to him. In some scenes, she's more prominent. Historians still argue whether this was religious symbolism or a bold political statement. Or maybe both. But what's clear is that Nefertiti was no ornament. Let's talk about Amarna, the city her husband built out in the desert to worship Aten, the sun disk. It was a radical move, one that disrupted the entire power structure of Egypt. The old gods were out. The priests were furious. The people were confused. But Nefertiti, she shined in the new order. Imagine strolling through the open courtyards of Amarna past sun-drenched colonnades, where offerings are made not in dark sanctuaries, but under open sky. And there she is, Nefertiti, offering incense, holding her daughters, her image repeated again and again until you begin to wonder, was this really Akhenaten's reign? Or theirs? And then comes the mystery. About year 12 or 13 of Akhenaten's reign, she vanishes. No fanfare, no funeral scenes, no weeping daughters or grand tombs. Just gone. And in her place, a new name appears, Smenkhkare. Here's the twist: some scholars believe Smenkhkare was a male co-regent. Others suggest it was Nefertiti under a new name ruling as pharaoh. It wouldn't be the first time a woman ruled Egypt disguised as a man, remember Hatshepsut. Maybe Nefertiti took notes. You lean closer to a stela, faint, cracked, almost shy in its preservation. A name is half carved, then scratched away. It might say Neferuaten. It might not. The sand doesn't give easy answers. Still, one thing is certain: someone co-ruled with Akhenaten late in his reign. Someone powerful enough to commission tombs, order decrees, and possibly even initiate the transition after his death. Whether it was Nefertiti, her daughter Meritaten, or an entirely new figure, we don't know. That's the maddening beauty of ancient history. It hides its queens just enough to make you chase them. But you want something tangible, right? Something real, let's talk busts. That famous limestone bust, you know, the one swan neck, perfect cheekbones, one eye missing. It was found in the workshop of Thutmose, a sculptor in Amarna. And here's the kicker, the bust may have been a prototype. Not for public display, but for teaching purposes. A model for students. She wasn't trying to immortalize herself, she was training others to depict her. Imagine being so iconic, you turn yourself into a lesson plan. And the missing eye. It was never completed. Scholars once thought it had been gouged out, but it turns out the other eye was never installed, which raises the question, was this piece ever meant to be finished? Or did something or someone interrupt the plan? You step into a smaller room now, one lined with faded papyrus scrolls and replicas of funerary shrouds. There is no confirmed tomb for Nefertiti. Her body has never been found. Yet she lingers, doesn't she? In museums, yes, but more than that, in the idea of what a queen could be. Smart, visible, powerful, possibly a ruler in disguise, or maybe not in disguise at all. A quirky fact, before we leave this room, in one Amarna relief, Nefertiti is shown bonking an enemy on the head with a club. That's usually pharaoh-only behavior. If that isn't queen energy, what is? You leave the chamber with a strange sense of closeness, as though she's just stepped out of sight and is waiting in the next hallway. Nefertiti isn't gone. She's just out of frame. Maybe that's where she wanted to be. The stone passage is narrower now, quieter. It smells faintly of plaster and tomb dust, as if you've stumbled into a place that hasn't been disturbed in centuries. You round a corner and pause, not because of a grand statue or golden shrine, but because what you're about to see doesn't exist on any tour map. A name etched once, then chiseled out. A title half-sanded from a temple wall. And just below it, barely visible in the limestone, Smenkhkare. This is the ghost section. Historians still argue whether Smenkhkare was a prince, a brother, a son-in-law, or Nefertiti herself ruling under a new name. Yeah. Welcome to ancient Egypt's greatest identity crisis. Let's set the stage. After Akhenaten's reign, when the sun disk Aten was the only god allowed, and the royal family had turned Amarna into their divine living room, something changed. Quickly, abruptly, Akhenaten disappears from the record, and suddenly Smenkhkare appears. He or she is crowned, rules for about 3 years, issues a few official seals, signs a couple of royal decrees, then vanishes. No grand burial, no legacy inscriptions, just dust. You walk along a corridor in Amarna's royal tomb. Your torch flickers over erased images. One section clearly had a dual figure, 2 rulers seated side by side. The names have been scratched out, but one faintly remains, Nefer-Nefer-Waten. That's not a male name. It's Nefertiti's throne name. So here's the theory: after Akhenaten died or weakened, Nefertiti dropped the title of Great Wife and assumed the role of co-pharaoh, possibly even under the mask of Smenkhkare. Some depictions show a young male pharaoh with features uncannily like hers. Same almond eyes, same jawline, same smooth face. And this wasn't new behavior for Egypt. Remember Hatshepsut, woman turned pharaoh, check. Beard and all, check. But this time the political landscape was on fire. The Aten cult was unpopular. The old priests of Amun were seething. The country needed stability, and Nefertiti might have stepped up under a more acceptable male identity. Or maybe Smenkhkare was real, a younger man, possibly Akhenaten's brother or son-in-law, installed as a puppet ruler, while someone else pulled the strings. You move into a side chamber where plaster molds show multiple revisions of the same face. One version wears the royal beard, one doesn't. One bears feminine lips, another masculine lines. You wonder, did they just change the art, or did they change the truth? Here's a quirky detail. Some coronation records list a co-ruler who shares the same epithets as Nefertiti, but signed in a male grammatical form. That's not just a typo. That's strategy. And this strategy worked, until it didn't. You sit on a low bench watching torchlight play across cracked sandstone. Smenkhkare, whoever they were, disappears within 3 years. Some say plague claimed them. Others whisper of political assassination. Or maybe the persona of Smenkhkare was no longer useful, and whoever wielded that mask stepped aside or was removed. There's one coffin in KV-55, the infamous Amarna cache, that some believed held Smenkhkare. But the body was badly decayed. Mixed evidence. Some say it was Akhenaten. Others say it was a young male around 18. Could that have been Smenkhkare? Could it have been Nefertiti in a male-coded burial? Still no definitive answer, just fragments, a pelvis here, a shattered cartouche there. And as you sit quietly, the deeper truth settles in ancient Egyptian power wasn't just about who ruled, it was about how you were seen. Public image was everything. Names were sacred. Statues were statements. To exist was to be carved into permanence. So when someone tried to erase Smenkhkare, it wasn't just historical oversight, it was punishment. Erasure was worse than execution. It was the theft of identity, of eternity. You trace your hand over a broken cartouche and feel that erasure like a bruise. Then you hear it distant, faint, the sound of ritual music. It echoes from another room, calling you forward. But just before you go, you glance one last time at the empty wall. And in the silence, you can almost imagine Nefertiti, not in her famous bust, but cloaked in the regalia of a king, staring down the chaos of empire, daring history to forget her. Spoiler, it didn't. It just needs help remembering. You step away from the shadowy corridor of erased names and enter a chamber that feels tense, hushed, like everyone inside has just heard bad news and is pretending they didn't. The light is low, filtered through gauzy linen drapes. It smells like new ink and worry. You're in a royal study now, or maybe a war room, though the weapons here aren't swords. They're letters, clay tablets, desperate pleas written in cuneiform. This is the story of Ankhesenamun, a teenage queen caught between dynasty's gods and the slow collapse of everything she's ever known. She was the daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, born during the religious revolution of the Aten cult. Her very name once honored the sun disk Ankhesenpaten. She lives through Aten. But after the death of her father, the failure of Amarna, and the resurgence of the old gods, she had to reinvent herself. She changed her name to Ankhesenamun. She lives through Amun. And she had to survive. You imagine her now, barely in her teens, married to the boy king Tutankhamun, who may have been her half-brother, maybe full brother. In royal Egypt, the math was often complicated and a little too close for comfort. Together, they were political bandages meant to soothe a wounded nation. He was the figurehead returning the gods to their temples. She was the bridge from the old regime to the new. But when Tutankhamun died suddenly without an heir, everything fell apart. You're now seated in a sunlit alcove beside a low table covered with diplomatic records. And here it is, a tablet known as the Dakamunzu letter. It was found in the Hittite capital of Hattusa, and it reads like a royal panic attack. In it, a widow queen of Egypt, unnamed, writes to the Hittite king, "My husband is dead. I have no son. They say you have many sons. If you send me one, he shall be my husband and king of Egypt." Let's pause. That's like the First Lady of the United States emailing the president of a rival nation and saying, "Hey, send your son over." He can run the White House now. Unprecedented, bold, and very, very desperate. Most scholars believe the writer was Ankhesenamun. She had no power base of her own, no child, no surviving brother to marry, no surviving anyone really except scheming generals and priests who wanted her gone. So she reaches out to a foreign enemy. It's brilliant and terrifying. The Hittite king Suppiluliuma I is suspicious. This might be a trap. But eventually he agrees. He sends his son Zananza to marry the queen. And here comes the dramatic punchline: Zananza never arrives. Somewhere near the Egyptian border, he is murdered, ambushed, disappeared. Historians still argue whether the hit was ordered by Horemheb, a powerful general, or I, Tutankhamun's elderly advisor, and the man who would soon crown himself pharaoh. Either way, the message is clear: Egypt doesn't want foreign princes on the throne. And as for Ankhesenamun, she vanishes. No confirmed tomb, no death records, no shrine. Just a ring found years later with her name inscribed next to A's. Not above, not equal, just there. Did she marry him to survive? Was she forced? Was it even her name on that ring or a ceremonial placeholder? No one knows. But you do know this. She fought back. You glance toward a painted wall where a young queen holds a lotus in one hand and a scroll in the other. She's elegant, yes, but her eyes are hard. Strategic. You don't send a diplomatic bombshell to a foreign empire unless you're clever and brave and just desperate enough to roll the dice. A quirky historical tidbit, that letter to the Hittites. It's the only known time in ancient Near Eastern history that a queen of Egypt asked a rival king for a husband. One time, one woman, and she almost pulled it off. You walk out into the garden. The sun is setting behind the colonnades, casting everything in warm, blood-orange light. You pause at a low wall where flowering vines twist around cracked limestone. Somewhere nearby, maybe she once stood trying to think 3 steps ahead of men who wanted her silenced. She didn't get her happy ending, but she didn't go quietly. And that in royal Egypt was a form of victory. The sun has dipped below the horizon now. A pale blue twilight settles over the palace, softening the lines of the walls and cloaking everything in that strange liminal glow, the one between heat and coolness, noise and silence, glory and grief. You pass through a quiet colonnade where no footsteps echo but your own. You're entering a sacred space. Not for gods this time, but for wombs. Yes, tonight you're stepping into the heart of dynastic survival, into the heavily perfumed, tightly guarded, and politically weaponized domain of royal childbirth. Because in ancient Egypt, the uterus wasn't private, it was national property. The moment a queen conceived, a political countdown began. Not just for the future of the family, but for the entire regime. A son meant legacy. A daughter might mean alliance, and no child that could mean war. You're led through a courtyard where women are gathered in low murmurs, nurses, midwives, wet nurses, and priestesses of Hathor. The mood is calm but electric, like a storm just out of sight. A queen is in labor and the entire kingdom is holding its breath. It's hard to overstate how much rode on these births. Inside the birthing chamber, the queen is surrounded by carved ivory wands, fertility figurines, and protective spells scratched on papyri. Incense coils in the corners. A midwife rubs oil across her belly. Another whispers spells invoking Taweret, the hippo goddess, with the body of a pregnant woman and the growl of a lioness. She guards the womb. And if you're wondering how terrifying she looks, imagine a very pregnant hippopotamus wearing crocodile armor. This is not a creature you argue with. Here's a quirky detail: birthing bricks. Instead of beds, Egyptian royal women often squatted on specially painted bricks, with figures of gods and blessings etched into their surfaces. Archaeologists have found several, each personalized like royal yoga mats. but for pushing out demigods. You sit near one. The paint is flaking, but you can still make out a faded Hathor offering milk and safety. It's strangely moving. In a world where the divine was everywhere, even the floor bore prayers. But not every pregnancy went smoothly. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant mortality were tragically common. That's why many queens had wet nurses who often became incredibly powerful behind the scenes. In some tombs, they're buried just steps away from the royal child they raised. Loyalty like that, you can't fake it. Still, when a child survived, especially a male heir, it was cause for national celebration, public festivals, offerings at temples, parades through the streets. Sometimes the placenta itself was buried ritually, as if to bind the child to the land. And here's where it gets even more political. Let's say the pharaoh has multiple wives and multiple sons. Suddenly, it's not just a birth. It's a contest. Whose son is legitimate, whose has the most divine favor, which mother has the best alliances, the most loyal priesthood backing her. This is how civil wars start. In fact, historians still argue whether some of the internal conflicts in the 18th and 19th dynasties were sparked not by foreign invasion, but by royal women competing for their sons' futures. The stakes weren't personal. They were national. You turn a corner and find a painted scene, a queen holding a chubby toddler presenting him to the gods. But look closer. Behind her stands a second woman, slightly taller, her hand on the boy's head, her face impassive. That's not just a nurse. That's politics in linen form. Some queens even had their sons raised in temples, not palaces surrounded by priests and inscriptions, instead of toys and playmates. Why? Because temple backing meant legitimacy, and legitimacy meant survival. The most chilling part, in some rare cases, if the baby turned out to be sickly or malformed, the child simply vanished from record, erased, rewritten. The royal uterus may have been sacred, but it wasn't guaranteed protection for the child. Still, many royal women rose from this crucible stronger. Consider Mutimwaya, mother of Amenhotep III. You probably haven't heard her name in a podcast or textbook, but she gave birth to one of Egypt's most glorious kings, and then had the rare honor of being declared a goddess posthumously. That's right, Mom of the Year turned divine. And she wasn't alone. A quirky fact: in some temple reliefs, the actual conception of a royal child is shown as being caused by the god Amun himself. We're talking Immaculate Conception Ancient Egypt edition. The king's mom, she got divine visitation. You get a visit from the OBGYN. Life isn't fair. As you exit the birthing chamber, the smell of milk and incense clings to your skin. Outside, the stars have bloomed above Thebes. The Nile moves like breath itself, steady, inevitable, full of secrets. You pause and think of all the royal women whose worth was measured not by their words or deeds, but by what they could produce. And you wonder how many of them whispered their own names into the ears of newborn pharaohs, how many reminded their sons, "You wouldn't be here without me," and how many never got the credit they earned until now. The palace is silent again. But this silence is not peaceful. It's thick like incense that's gone stale. You're not in a birthing room now. You're in a mourning chamber where perfumes mix with prayers and nothing moves except the slow sway of linen veils and the flicker of oil lamps. A queen has died. And when a royal woman leaves this world, Egypt feels it. Not just the court, not just the temple. The very cosmic balance shifts, at least according to the priests in charge of managing her departure. You watch as servants shuffle in silence, scattering lotus petals on the stone floor. Harpists pluck slow notes. Professional mourners, yes, that was a real job, wail rhythmically, tearing at their wigs, their cheeks dusted with ochre to signal grief. It's dramatic, It's stylized. But make no mistake, it's also a performance meant to stir the gods. Because here's the truth, ancient Egyptians didn't fear death. They planned for it. Especially royal women. Tombs were commissioned while they were still young. Jewelry was inscribed with protective spells. Scarabs were chosen not just for beauty, but for magical efficiency. You glance into a shadowed corner where a canopic jar sits, its lid shaped like a goddess's head. This jar once held a queen's liver. Next to it, one for her lungs. And if you're wondering whether a liver can be holy, you've never met a mortuary priest. Let's zoom in on one ritual, the opening of the mouth. This was a ceremony performed to allow the deceased to eat, speak, and breathe in the afterlife. A priest would touch a ritual blade often shaped like a fish, or adze to the lips, nose, and eyes of the mummy. It's poetic, intimate, and slightly eerie when you consider the corpse had been dehydrated for weeks. A fringe theory even suggests that in earlier periods, queens weren't always embalmed the same way as kings, perhaps, to avoid sexual violation in the afterlife. Yeah, ancient anxieties ran deep. You walk alongside a painted tomb wall. A queen is shown before Osiris, god of the dead, her arms raised in reverence. She's dressed in diaphanous linen, crowned with horns, and a sun disk, symbols of Hathor, goddess of beauty and motherhood, now welcoming her into the next world. Here's where things get tricky. Sometimes mourning was real. Queens died young, especially in childbirth, and some were beloved enough to inspire decades of posthumous offerings, statues, poems, even entire cults. Remember, Amosa Nefertari worshipped as a goddess for 500 years. That's Beyoncé-level legacy. But sometimes grief was political theater. You step through a side hall where a new queen is already being dressed in perfumed robes, her eyes lined in kohl, her lips stained red. She's not smiling. She knows one queen dies, another must rise. The rituals of mourning aren't just about loss, they're about transition. Ensuring the power structure remains smooth, the gods appeased the lineage uninterrupted. In this moment, you wonder how many queens mourned out of love, and how many because they had to, under the eyes of 1,000 watchful courtiers. A quirky little nugget, sometimes mourning was gendered. Royal women would gather in a ritual courtyard called the Place of the Beautiful Ones. They'd chant, cry, and scratch their faces. The more dramatic the mourning, the more honored the dead. In contrast, male officials were expected to maintain decorum. You cry too hard, you risk looking weak. But the women, they practically invented public grief. Now shift your gaze to a royal sarcophagus, pink granite covered in spells. It belongs to Queen Taosret, who was not just a wife, but later ruled as pharaoh herself. Her tomb, KV-14, is massive, elaborate, painted in rich indigo gold and rust-red hues. But here's the twist, her death didn't guarantee peace. In fact, she may have been overthrown, her name scratched out, her titles replaced, and yet the tomb still holds echoes of her grandeur. You kneel by the doorway. The air is cooler here, earthier. Death in ancient Egypt wasn't an end. It was a transformation into memory, myth, divinity. And for queens, it was often their most powerful role yet. Historians still argue whether some royal women gained more influence after death than in life through cults, ancestor worship, or dynastic myth-making. Death was a chance to rebrand, to elevate their image, to be remembered not as someone's wife, but as a figure of cosmic balance. As the oil lamps flicker lower, you find yourself drawn to a carved hymn etched into a nearby stela. It reads, "She who was beloved in life shall rule in light beyond death. Her name shall rise with the flood. Her perfume shall ride the wind." You let the words wash over you, the cadence lulling ancient yet oddly familiar, because you realize now in this world, the queens did not simply die. They echoed, through song, through stone, through whispered prayers spoken by strangers 1,000 years later. Like you leave the hush of the morning chambers behind and enter a corridor glowing with painted scenes of temple life, rows of priests in leopard skin cloaks, processions of sacred barks, offerings heaped like a banquet for gods. But as your eyes adjust, you notice something unexpected. Among the priests stand women, not passive attendants, not handmaidens. These women are leading the rites, holding scepters, flanked by musicians and lion-headed goddesses. One of them raises her arms before a towering statue of Amun, and the hieroglyphs above her head say it clearly, God's wife of Amun. Tonight you're meeting the queens who wielded power without husbands. No royal marriage, no shared throne, just authority, charisma, and divine appointment. Welcome to the secretive, spiritually loaded, and surprisingly political world of the gods' wives of Amun. You settle into the shadow of a Theban temple. Torches sputter near the walls. Somewhere deeper in the halls, drums echo a low ritual rhythm. And as the music fades, you're transported back to the 21st dynasty, when Egypt was fractured, uncertain, and the priesthood of Amun had grown more powerful than the throne itself. This was a period where pharaohs ruled from Tanis in the north, but in Thebes, the real sway belonged to the high priests and their female counterparts, the gods' wives. These women weren't just performing hymns. They controlled temple estates, land holdings, labor forces, and massive wealth. They had their own courts, their own staff, and even their own tombs rivaling those of kings. And no, this wasn't symbolic. This was institutional power given through ceremony and sealed by divine claim. Here's a quirky detail: many of these gods' wives were celibate. They didn't marry. They didn't bear heirs. Why? Because their loyalty was to Amun, and the role passed through adoption, not bloodline. That's right. A reigning god's wife would adopt her successor, often a niece or younger cousin, ensuring continuity and spiritual legitimacy. One of the most famous, Shepenupet II. Her name rolls off the tongue like incense smoke. She ruled Thebes as a spiritual sovereign during the 25th dynasty, when Nubian kings held the pharaonic crown. Despite being technically subordinate to the king, Shepenupet controlled more land and resources in Thebes than any male official around her. She appears in art dressed like royalty, broad collars, the vulture headdress of queens, the was scepter of power. Not a wife, not a mother, just a ruler. Historians still argue whether these women were genuinely autonomous or tightly managed by male priests behind the curtain. But the wealth of their estates, the complexity of their records, and the reverence of their tomb inscriptions say otherwise. You pass into a chamber filled with painted scrolls, funerary papyri, written specifically for God's wives. These aren't the standard Book of the Dead illustrations. They're personalized. They depict the God's wife not as a passive soul entering the afterlife, but as a priestess negotiating with gods, bargaining, commanding, transforming. And remember those male pharaohs who wanted to be remembered forever. Many gods' wives achieved the same without ever going to war, marrying strategically or birthing an heir. Take Nitocris, adopted by Shepenupet and serving during the 26th dynasty. She wasn't just a token figurehead. Her titles include Foremost of Noble Women, Great One in the Palace of Amun, and my personal favorite, She Who Pacifies the Gods. That's big energy. A quirky architectural detail. Many of their tombs were built within temple precincts, not the Valley of the Queens. That's rare, sacred. As if even in death they didn't want to leave the god's side. You wonder what it felt like to be revered, obeyed, and entrusted with power, yet never expected to marry or produce children. In a world where most royal women were judged by their fertility, these women were honored for something else: spiritual authority. And they weren't isolated. Letters survive between God's wives and other rulers. Some commissioned art. Others negotiated temple expansions. Some even issued edicts. You know, casual divine governance. One inscription shows a god's wife holding a mirror before the statue of Amun, symbolically showing him his own light. There's something poetic in that. These women didn't shine for others. They reflected divinity. They redirected power. You sit on a carved bench and glance toward a faded mural. The figure in it looks calm, eyes half lowered, not boastful, not weeping, just assured, centered. And maybe that's what the role of God's wife truly was. Not political ambition or maternal duty, but sovereignty through stillness. It's tempting to think of them as ceremonial placeholders. But as you feel the ancient stone hum faintly beneath your hands, you sense something deeper. They weren't placeholders. They were pillars. The temple grounds grow darker now, the flickering torchlight catching only glimpses of the carvings on the walls, faces that watch in silence, names half preserved, half erased. You follow a winding corridor that doesn't lead to a throne room or a tomb, but to something quieter. Personal, political, delicate. You're about to enter the world of dowries, not just bridal gifts or ceremonial tokens. In ancient Egypt, dowries were weapons, bargaining chips, and sometimes the price of peace. Welcome to the dowry wars, where international princesses weren't just exchanged, they were exported like luxury goods with diplomatic strings attached. You pass through a painted hall where scenes show Egyptian envoys arriving in foreign courts. On one side, donkeys carry spices and gold. On the other, women stand beneath canopies flanked by ladies-in-waiting. Their expressions are regal but wary. They know what this is. A transaction. Let's talk about the big picture. Egypt wasn't isolated. It had treaties with Babylonia, Mitanni, the Hittites, and more. And in these alliances, women were often the currency of trust. But here's the catch: Egyptian princesses didn't go abroad. Not officially. Foreign rulers begged for them, cried for them in clay tablet correspondence. But the Egyptian response was always some variation of "no daughter of Egypt is sent to another land." Why? Because it implied subordination. And Egypt didn't bow. Instead, they received foreign princesses. Mitanni, Hittite, Canaanite, all brought to Egypt in gold-laden caravans, perfumed and prepped, offered as wives to the pharaoh. But these women weren't just footnotes. Some became mothers of kings. Others became political forces in their own right. You sit near a stone stela inscribed with the names of a foreign bride, Gilukhepha, daughter of a Mitanni king, married to Amenhotep III. She arrived with a retinue of 317 women. That's not a bridal party. That's a small kingdom on foot. Here's a quirky tidbit: some princesses were given Egyptian names upon arrival, and even converted to the Egyptian religion, though often they kept their foreign deities tucked discreetly into household shrines. You know, just in case. Now picture the inner palace. You've got Egyptian queens used to the language, the rituals, the court watching as these outsiders arrive, often younger, exotic, intriguing to the pharaoh, and backed by powerful relatives abroad. Do you smell smoke? That's not incense. That's jealousy. And sometimes things boiled over. Historians still argue whether the tensions between native Egyptian queens and foreign wives ever led to palace conspiracies. The evidence is tantalizing but unclear. But letters survive, angry, pleading, manipulative, between rulers and kings, between fathers and daughters, all centered around one question: Was she treated well? Some foreign kings sent annual check-ins. Others demanded tribute in return, especially if their daughter was now mother to a future king. And still others threatened to break alliances if they believed their daughter was being slighted. You glance at a fragment of papyrus. The translation reads, "She weeps in your palace." You swore she would be first among wives. Why is she hidden from the feasts? That's not politics. That's family drama international edition. And let's not forget the Hittite princess nearly sent to Egypt to marry Tutankhamun's widow, a move that ended in betrayal and assassination, as you remember from Ankhesenamun's desperate letter. You now sit on a carved bench in the women's quarters. This is where those brides waited, learned new languages, memorized etiquette, adjusted to the climate, the diet, the stairs. You imagine one pressing a painted fan to her face, wondering if her name would be remembered, or just folded into the long fabric of Egyptian history, smoothed flat like linen under weight. And some of them made it. Truly. Some bore sons. Others gained influence in religious cults. A few may have advised kings quietly, of course, behind latticed screens and perfumed messages. But most they disappeared. Their foreign names dropped, their native gods replaced, their roles reduced to secondary wife. You trace your hand along a wall carving. A woman stands behind the pharaoh, not beside him. Her profile is delicate, her eyes downcast. No caption, no title. You whisper her name anyway. Maybe someone hears. Because if there's one thing you're starting to understand tonight, it's that every woman in this palace was playing a game of survival, of legacy, of influence, whether born in Memphis or Mitanni, and the stakes only the future of Egypt itself. The corridors grow warmer now, more intimate. You're not in a throne room, not in a temple, not even in a chamber built for ceremony. This space feels lived in layers of sandalwood smoke clinging to the walls, soft cushions faded from sun and secrets. The air hums with the energy of shared glances, closed doors, and whispered rumors. You've just stepped into the most dangerous terrain in royal Egypt sisterhood. Specifically, the kind found between royal sisters and rival queens, where blood ties could turn to binding chains or blades. If you thought palace politics were tense before, add in shared genetics, overlapping ambitions, and an entire empire watching. Welcome to the high-stakes world of royal sisters' rival thrones. You pass a relief showing two women standing beside a king. They're dressed nearly identically, braided wigs, tight-fitting linen gowns, vulture headdresses, wide collars. Only the placement of their hands gives a clue to hierarchy. One gently rests her palm on the king's arm. The other holds a lotus and glares. Let's rewind. In Egypt, it was common for pharaohs to marry their sisters, a tradition rooted in divine mythology, mimicking the unions of gods like Isis and Osiris. But in real life, this made court dynamics complicated. Imagine growing up beside your sister in the palace, playing together, learning the same rituals, watching the same processions, and then suddenly competing for influence, visibility, and the right to shape the next generation of kings. Take Nefertari and Hunutmire, two royal women in the court of Ramesses II. Nefertari was the chief queen, beloved, poetic, literally immortalized in one of the most stunning tombs in the Valley of the Queens. Hunutmire, possibly his daughter or his wife or both. The records blur. Historians still argue whether Hunutmire was elevated late in Ramesses' reign to honor her birthright, or to politically counterbalance Nefertari's rising cult status. Either way, their titles overlapped, their roles intersected. And in temple art, their images often share space, but rarely the same prominence. Now imagine the quiet war behind the walls. The subtler forms of sabotage, shifting alliances among servants, manipulating religious festivals, guiding which children were placed in which priesthoods. You walk into a side chamber where two faded statues stand shoulder to shoulder, female forms, arms at their sides. Their names have been erased, but their crowns remain. They were queens, likely sisters, possibly both. And let's not forget Ankhesenamun and her probable half-sister Meritaten, both daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. At one point, Meritaten may have been queen to her father, or to Smenkhara, or to her own brother. The tangle of roles becomes almost unbearable. Here's a fringe theory. Some Egyptologists believe Meritaten and Ankhesenamun may have co-ruled either side by side or in quiet opposition. One perhaps managing court rituals, the other diplomacy. Two sisters, two survivors, one crumbling dynasty between them, and a quirky historical note in Amarna letters: sister princesses were often trained in diplomacy as early as age 7. They'd learn foreign languages, music, and flattery skills meant for smoothing over royal nerves during tense banquets or marriage negotiations. Now imagine applying those same skills across the breakfast table with a sister who might soon outrank you. You pause before a painted stela, showing a royal woman with her arm around another. It could be affection. It could be a vice grip. You're not sure. In ancient Egypt, the boundary between ally and adversary was paper-thin, especially in the royal court. There are records of sister wives supporting each other publicly, only to later vanish from record as one gained favor. You glance down a hallway rumored to connect the women's quarters to the priestess's residence. This passage would have been perfect for late-night strategy, for whispered plans or warnings passed between siblings whose futures were being decided without their consent or because of it. You wonder, did they plot together? Did they argue? Did they cry in the same bed they once shared as children, realizing that only one might be remembered? Because make no mistake, memory is power here. The sister whose name survives in stone wins. But sometimes, just sometimes, both names survive. Take Cleopatra VII and Arsinoe IV. Yes, we're jumping ahead a millennium, but stick with me. Cleopatra had her sister executed in a temple sanctuary. That's how far these rivalries could go. And though you won't find many bloody daggers in the hands of 18th dynasty queens, you'll find plenty of court reshufflings, suspicious disappearances, and rival priesthoods quietly switching loyalties. As you exit the chamber, a cool breeze stirs the hanging linen. Somewhere beyond this wall, drums begin to beat another ceremony, another performance. Maybe another sister is being elevated or exiled. You press your hand to the wall one last time. Beneath the surface, there's another name. Faint, hidden, almost erased, but still there. Because sisterhood in Egypt was never just about blood. It was about survival. You descend a sloping hallway now deeper into the palace's private interior, a space where even servants walked softly, where the air was thicker and scented with things you can't quite name. Musk, crushed rose, and something darker. This is the realm of beauty medicine and quiet murder. Tonight you're surrounded by copper bowls, crushed minerals, flasks of oil, and trays of dried herbs arranged with ritual precision. But don't be fooled, this is no day spa. You're in a royal cosmetics chamber, and the line between perfume and poison here is alarmingly thin. Because in ancient Egypt, appearance was everything but power that was always in the application. A queen's beauty wasn't just vanity. It was symbolic magic. A perfectly kohl-lined eye invoked the protection of Horus. A slick of scented oil could signal divine favor. A carefully chosen wig, yes, wigs were a big deal, could reinforce authority, fertility, or mourning. You step up to a polished bronze mirror. Your reflection stares back, ghost-like, distorted. Imagine the queens who used this mirror, adjusting their collars, practicing their smiles, planning their futures. But here's the twist, some of them were fighting for their lives. not just their image. Let's start with cosmetics. Black coal lined the eyes not just for style, but as a protective layer against sun glare and infection. Blue-green malachite shadow wasn't just pretty, it was considered spiritually cleansing. A quirky fact: makeup boxes were often buried with queens, complete with applicators, ointments, and compact-sized mirrors. Even in the afterlife, you had to look good for Judgment Day. But the same materials used for divine beauty could easily become deadly. Lead-based coal, if overused, could cause neurological issues. Some perfumed oils, if tainted, could trigger seizures or slow poisoning. And don't even get started on the herbal concoctions used for fertility regulation, some of which could cause hemorrhaging, infertility, or hallucinations. Now imagine these substances in the hands of a jealous rival, a concubine, a political operative, or worse, a royal healer with shifting loyalties. You pause before a painted relief showing a queen anointing a statue of Hathor. The oil in her hand looks golden, fragrant, innocent. But what if it wasn't? Historians still argue whether some sudden royal deaths, especially among queens, were caused by illness or carefully masked poisonings. The records never say assassination, but they say things like she grew quiet, she weakened, she returned to the gods sooner than expected. Sometimes the poison wasn't in a cup. It was in a balm, or a sleep draft, or the petals scattered on her bed. You walk through a curtained archway into a room that smells like crushed frankincense and myrrh. In the center, a low alabaster table holds bowls of dried ingredients: saffron, henna, lotus, and a vial of something labeled Sacred Essence of Hathor. You dip a finger near the rim. It burns even before it touches your skin. A reminder, every tool of grace could be twisted into a weapon. Let's talk about medicine. Royal women had access to the best healers in Egypt, physicians trained at the Père Ankh, or House of Life. They practiced surgical techniques, herbalism, and ritual magic. But they also functioned under court pressure. Imagine trying to treat a queen who might be pregnant or cursed or suspected of carrying a rival's heir. How do you prescribe when every dose could be seen as sabotage? One recorded papyrus advises to cure a woman's womb: oil of cedar seed, of pomegranate honey warmed under moonlight. Sounds gentle, until you realize cedar oil in high doses can cause miscarriage, and pomegranate used as a contraceptive and abortifacient since antiquity. Beauty and danger, medicine and manipulation. A servant brushes past you carrying a silver basin. You catch a glimpse of something dark at the bottom, sticky and sweet. Maybe it's a salve, maybe it's not. You stop in front of another wall, relief: a woman reclining, attended by handmaidens. She wears no crown. Her eyes are closed, her lips parted. The caption, "She who was favored." There's no mention of how she died, but her rival's name appears just a few feet away, draped in praise, surrounded by offerings. You connect the dots. Maybe they're not dots. Maybe they're dagger marks. A final quirky detail: before you go, royal wigs were often perfumed with cones of scented fat, which melted slowly in the heat and dripped down the back, leaving a fragrant trail. It sounds luxurious until you learn that some of those cones were laced with narcotics, meant to calm the nerves, or dull the mind, or make someone easier to influence. As you leave the chamber, you feel a strange gratitude for your modern drug labels. Because in this palace, every perfume was a gamble, every ointment a coded message, and every queen, she had to know the difference. You're deeper underground now. The air is still not from lack of movement, but from too much secrecy. You light a torch, and its glow reveals something unexpected: not towering statues or regal murals, but narrow corridors, locked doors, and whispers carved in stone. This isn't a place for tourists. This is where the most delicate legacies were buried, hidden, or misfiled on purpose. You've entered the domain of the women connected to one of Egypt's most iconic names, Tutankhamun. But you're not here to gawk at golden death masks or cursed tombs. You're here to follow the traces of queens, the women who orbited Tutankhamun's short, strange reign, whose lives were just as extraordinary and far more obscured. Let's start with Ankhesenamun, his wife and half-sister. You already know the desperate letter she wrote to the Hittites, trying to avoid being forced to marry an old advisor like I. But there's another layer, one that lives right here in the Valley of the Kings. You stand at the mouth of KV-63, a chamber discovered in 2005. It's not a burial chamber, not exactly. No mummies, no sarcophagus, just storage jars, linens, and embalming equipment. But here's the kicker: some believe this chamber was prepared for a woman. Maybe Ankhesenamun, maybe a secondary wife, maybe someone important enough to warrant royal treatment until everything changed. And here's a fringe theory that makes your spine tingle. Some Egyptologists now suspect Ankhesenamun may be buried somewhere near Tutankhamun, possibly in a hidden chamber behind his tomb walls. Scans have shown architectural anomalies, sealed spaces behind murals. Nothing's been opened. Not yet. You move deeper into a nearby annex, KV-21, where two mummies were found in tangled linen, unmarked. One of them, DNA analysis, suggests she's the mother of Tutankhamun's two stillborn daughters, and the other, possibly her sister, possibly her rival. Neither was identified in their own time. But now, millennia later, science is catching up. Let's talk about those two royal daughters. Their tiny coffins were found in Tutankhamun's tomb, placed carefully beside him. Their names are lost. No titles, no statues. Just two miniature sarcophagi and the knowledge that they mattered enough to follow their father into eternity. You pause beside one. The carving is precise, the face serene. A princess whose life lasted barely long enough to breathe, yet whose death echoed through dynastic succession. If either had survived, history might have looked very different. And speaking of different, let's talk about Kia. Remember her, the mysterious wife of Akhenaten, possibly Tutankhamun's mother. Her name was once everywhere on wine jars, on blocks reused in later constructions, even on a shrine. And then erased, replaced, forgotten. Some scholars believe she was foreign, perhaps from Mitanni. Others argue she was merely politically inconvenient, or maybe she died young, and the regime just needed to clean the slate. But here's something peculiar. A gilded coffin in Tutankhamun's tomb, meant for a queen, shows clear signs of repurposing. Her name was scraped off, her image reworked. Could this have been Kia's original burial container? Or was it built for Ankhesenamun only to be reassigned? You're now in a dim hallway lined with niches. Each one may have once held a stela or a nameplate or a mask. All are empty now. And that's the theme here, isn't it? Absence. These women shaped dynasties, carried heirs, possibly ruled behind the curtain, and yet they're known by their missing pieces. A broken statue base, a partially preserved cartouche, a ring buried in an unofficial tomb with a name that shouldn't be there. You brush your fingers across one such ring now in a museum vault, once on someone's hand. It bears the names of Ankhesenamun and I, suggesting she married her much older, politically shrewd step-grandfather. Was it forced? Was it survival? Was it an act of resistance so subtle we still haven't recognized it? Historians still argue whether her marriage to A was a last-ditch attempt to protect her status or a trap she couldn't escape. You sit beside a wall that's been plastered smooth. The absence of writing here is louder than any inscription, because these women weren't always erased by accident. Sometimes erasure was the final move in a game of court survival. the ultimate power play to steal memory. But here's a comforting thought. They weren't forgotten. Not entirely. Because you're here, retracing their steps, piecing together fragments, holding space for the ones history tried to silence. And down here in the dark that matters. You emerge from the tomb corridors into the glow of daybreak, early light brushing over the palace walls, painting long shadows across the sandstone. The silence here is less ominous now, more reflective, as if the queens you just walked with are settling back into their quiet, sacred rest. But don't relax yet, because now you're stepping into a space where power isn't whispered or inherited. It's worn. Tonight you're examining what queens wore and what those choices meant. Because in ancient Egypt, a crown wasn't just decoration, it was declaration. You find yourself in a dressing chamber, not a walk-in closet, a war room of image and identity lined with wig stands, linen bolts, gold-threaded sandals, and shelves stacked with cosmetics, jewelry, and regalia. Let's start with the obvious headdresses. The vulture cap, worn by queens, not kings, symbolized maternal protection and dominion. Add a uraeus cobra on the forehead. And now the queen wasn't just protected by the gods, she was channeling them. Take Nefertari, the beloved queen of Ramesses II. In temple reliefs, she wears the full regalia, the vulture headdress, topped with sun disk and cow horns, a symbol of Hathor. She's not standing behind the king. She's offering to the gods on her own, dressed like someone they'd actually listen to. Then there's color. Ancient Egyptian linen was typically white, cool, symbolic of purity. But queens, they were allowed exceptions. Saffron, yellow, indigo blue, and even dyed red linen made rare appearances in high ceremonies. Each hue carried weight, fertility, divinity, danger. Here's a quirky tidbit. Egyptian queens sometimes wore elaborately pleated linen gowns, held together with nothing but knots and scent. No buttons, no pins. Just the physics of fabric and the presence of perfume. If that's not commanding, I don't know what is. And let's talk jewelry. Amulets weren't just pretty, each had a purpose. The ankh for life, the scarab for rebirth, the wadjet eye for protection. These were more than fashion statements. They were armor. You hold a broad collar in your hands. It's heavy. Lapis carnelian gold beads strung together in a wide arc meant to rest on the shoulders and drape across the chest. Imagine the message it sends in a room full of anxious diplomats. I am not delicate. I am divine. Even sandals had status. Papyrus for the commoners. Leather for the elite. Gold-leafed sandals for the queens, yes, actual gold, strapped onto their feet like statements of casual superiority. Wigs, oh, they were entire political tools. A queen could wear a short bob to signal modesty, a long braided wig for fertility, or double-layered coils to mimic the imagery of a goddess. They were perfumed with cones of scented fat that melted slowly in the sun, leaving fragrant trails that announced a queen's presence before she even arrived. Historians still argue whether queens had input into their dress or were simply adorned by attendants according to ritual. But based on the complexity and variation of royal women's iconography, it's clear they curated their image with intention. You're standing now in front of a mirror-like pool inside a secluded garden courtyard. The water reflects palm trees, clouds, and you. Imagine a queen standing here adjusting her collar, her painted lips, the fall of her wig. She's not just fixing her look, she's preparing her message. Because in royal Egypt, every outfit was a sentence. Every earring a punctuation mark. And yes, there were days of relaxation moments captured in tomb paintings where queens wore simple white linen, a lotus tucked behind the ear. But even then, beauty was strategy. Here's a fringe theory that's too good not to share. Some scholars believe that Queen's attire was deliberately designed to mirror divine statues, especially when entering temples. That way, the line between woman and goddess blurred subtly yet powerfully. You step into one final alcove. Here, mannequins are dressed in ceremonial replicas. One wears the elaborate winged cape of Isis. Another wears only jewelry, wide collars, armlets, a belt of bells, clothing by sound. It's almost overwhelming. But you realize this royal women in Egypt didn't have social media. They had linen, gold, color, and they used it to shape perception daily. Their bodies weren't just vessels of beauty. They were canvases of myth. And every time they walked into a room, they weren't saying, "Notice me." They were saying, "This is who I am, and this is who you must believe I am." And most of the time, it worked. The wind picks up now, soft but insistent, as if it's pushing you toward a different kind of chamber. This one isn't lined with gold or stacked with perfume jars. It's not silent either. In fact, it whispers. Because tonight, you've stepped into the written world of Egypt's royal women, not inscriptions on walls or titles in stone, but words written by their own hands. You're surrounded by papyrus scrolls stacked in cubby-like shelves, some bound with faded string, others spread open under translucent linen covers. There's an energy here, a quiet urgency, like someone just stepped out and will return at any moment to finish a thought. You are in the royal scribal archive of women. Let's start with a surprising truth. Many Egyptian royal women were literate. Not just reading, but writing. Religious texts, legal petitions, letters, poems, even spells. Their education was often private, elite, and deeply spiritual. After all, to read was to interpret the will of the gods. To write, that was almost divine. You kneel beside a scroll fragment from the 19th dynasty. The hieratic script is delicate, the strokes still sharp. This letter is from a queen to a priest requesting that he delay a ritual due to an illness in the royal household. It's personal, specific, unfiltered. She signs it with a flourish and a title, "She who speaks for the house." That's not decoration. That's authority. Now let's get juicy. Some scrolls didn't survive because of decay, but because they were deliberately destroyed, censored, erased. Which raises a thrilling question. What did these women write that made someone uncomfortable enough to silence it? Here's a fringe theory. Certain healing spells in the papyrus ebers may have been attributed to female scribes, or passed down orally through midwife lineages before ever reaching male record keepers. They weren't just patients in the system, they were intellectual agents inside it. You walk past a shelf of dream books. Yes, the ancient Egyptians had those too. Several carry the names of women in their margins. Some even include notes about dreams involving political omens, royal pregnancies, or rival queens. You can practically hear them whispering, "Keep this between us." And then you reach a locked cabinet. Inside it is a replica of a now-lost text, famously attributed to Queen Nefertari. No, not the poem in her tomb. This one was a personal letter copied from a limestone shard. A love letter possibly addressed to Ramesses II during his campaigns. In it she writes, "May the winds guide your arrows, but not your heart. May the gods return you to me whole, but not unchanged. I will wear your scent until it fades. I will speak your name until mine is forgotten." Simple, lyrical, and utterly human. A quirky detail, some love poems from the New Kingdom are written in the female voice, even though scribes officially were male. Some scholars argue these were dictated by royal women. Others believe they were copied from women's originals meant to be recited in private. Either way, the emotional fingerprint is there. You sit before an open scroll covered in protective netting. It's a legal document, a property claim made by a queen after her husband's death. She lists her holdings in grain, cattle, perfumes, and household staff. Not only does she know her inventory, she references specific temple fees, market rates, and late payments due from a nobleman who has no excuse, as the gods know. A queen with a ledger and receipts, be very afraid. Historians still argue whether women's authorship was common or exceptional, but the evidence is mounting, and each piece feels like a whisper from the past that refused to stay buried. And here's something a little magical. You find a curse scroll, likely penned by a royal priestess. It's not for an enemy army, it's for a rival woman. The spell asks Hathor to twist the woman's tongue to sour her wine, to make her reflection vanish in water. That's not just magic, that's poetic vengeance. As you prepare to leave, you realize you've been tracing a path that most historians barely acknowledge. A path where queens didn't just rule with crowns, but with ink. Where they shaped politics not just through alliances or heirs, but through ideas. And their ideas still ripple through the fragments, the syntax, the margin notes, the prayers squeezed between love poems. So next time someone says ancient queens were silent, hand them a scroll and tell them to start reading. You move upward now, physically and emotionally, into a room that feels sharper, less hushed. Gone are the soft veils and the perfume trays. This space crackles with tension, like a chamber where words were spoken too loudly, and some of them could kill. The walls are decorated not with serene goddesses or motherly queens, but with jackals, vipers, and knives. And in the flickering torchlight, you finally understand this is the arena of court conspiracies and sacred revenge. Because for all their grace and elegance, royal women weren't just symbols of balance and beauty. They were also plotters, protectors, survivors, and when necessary, executioners. You're standing in the shadow of one of the most infamous plots in Egyptian history, the harem conspiracy against Ramesses III during the 20th dynasty. The facts fragmented, the consequences lethal. The center of it all, a queen named Tia, not to be confused with the earlier legendary queen mother of Amenhotep III. This Tia was a lesser wife, but with ambition like flint and the motive of a mother. Her son Pentawar had a claim to the throne, but he wasn't the designated heir. So Tia did what women have done across centuries. When the system blocks the door, she found another entrance. Historians still argue whether Tia was the mastermind or just a desperate pawn. But what we know is this: multiple members of the royal harem, palace officials, and even court magicians were implicated in the plot to kill the pharaoh and install Pentawar as king. You can almost hear them whispering in the hallways, midnight meetings behind linen screens, coded messages baked into honey cakes, promises sealed with perfume and blood. But they failed. Ramesses III died, yes, but likely from a severed throat, not a quiet poisoning. CT scans of his mummy revealed a wound so deep his head was nearly detached. Not something easily hidden. The trial that followed was massive, brutal, and deeply theatrical. Tribunals forced suicides, public shame. Some conspirators were burned alive, an extremely rare punishment in Egyptian law reserved for the worst crimes. Others were mutilated or forced to take their own lives. One judge was even caught accepting bribes from a defendant and was summarily executed. As for Pentawar, his mummy was found in an unmarked grave, mouth agape, in what looks like a scream body bloated with shame. DNA confirmed he was the son of Ramesses III. Most believe he died by forced suicide, a rope, and the end of a dynasty dream. And Tia vanished. Not a single confirmed tomb. No statue, no shrine, just fragments. ashes of ambition in the halls of memory. But Ta was not alone in the grand theater of royal conspiracies. You pass a stela showing Hatshepsut, yes, the great pharaoh, calmly making offerings. But beneath her smooth relief lies a secret. Some scholars believe she survived an assassination attempt early in her rule, possibly orchestrated by nobles loyal to Thutmose III. If true, her reign becomes not just a success story, but a miraculous survival. And Nefertiti. As you learned earlier, her disappearance during Akhenaten's final years still stirs questions. Some fringe theories suggest she was ousted in a court coup, her name nearly scrubbed out by a priestly class desperate to restore the old gods. Even Cleopatra, centuries later, would live and die by court politics, fighting her own sister Arsinoe for control, eventually ordering her execution at the steps of a temple. When women ruled in Egypt, they didn't just face foreign threats. They faced daggers at dinner. Here's a quirky detail: many tombs of royal women included amulets of knives, small gold, or faience blades, meant for protection in the afterlife. But they also symbolized something else: awareness. These women knew. The palace wasn't safe. The divine wasn't always just. Even in their most sacred moments, queens carried weapons in miniature. You step through a hallway lined with damaged inscriptions. One is partially preserved. It reads, "She who served the gods and saw their shadows." You pause. Because being a royal woman in Egypt wasn't just about pleasing gods and birthing heirs. It was about navigating shadows, about surviving enemies you couldn't name out loud, about winning wars fought with whispers. Some used curses, some used scrolls, some used children, and some simply waited. Because in this court, patience could kill more surely than poison. And for every woman whose name was erased, there is another whose silence was a strategy and whose legacy still burns beneath the plaster. The air shifts again, cooler now, as if the temple walls are exhaling. The drums from distant rituals fade into birdsong, and you find yourself walking along a colonnade open to the sky. The columns are painted with blue lotuses and goddess eyes, and above you, the carvings soften from war and intrigue into something else. You've entered the domain where queens were worshipped, idealized, and mythologized. But this isn't peace. It's pressure. It's performance. It's the thin, treacherous edge between the sacred and the scandalous. Tonight, you explore the paradox of royal womanhood in Egypt, when a queen became a goddess to the people but a target to the court. You're standing now in front of a relief where a royal woman, likely Nefertari, offers milk to Hathor. She wears a flowing white gown and a crown shaped like a throne, her own title made manifest. She's adored, elegant, untouchable. But walk a few steps, and you'll find a different image. Here, a lesser wife stands behind the king, expression demure, hands full of offerings. The gods ignore her. She is present, but not powerful. Decorative, but not divine. This was the spectrum from exalted to expendable. Let's talk about how a queen could become sacred. The key figure here is Hathor, goddess of love music, motherhood, and joy. Queens often aligned themselves with her. They invoked her beauty, her charm, her fertility. To be seen as a living Hathor was the ultimate PR move. It meant your touch healed, your smile blessed. Your scent alone kept the Nile from drying. But that divine image came with an impossible standard. You had to remain untouched, yet bear heirs. Gracious, yet commanding. Pious, yet politically astute. And if you failed, if you were barren or too loud or outshone by another, you didn't just lose favor. You could fall from grace in one generation flat. Here's a quirky detail: during the New Kingdom, queens were sometimes depicted as sistrum players, the rattle-like instrument used in temple rituals. The implication: they didn't just rule, They entertained the gods. They had to. Their approval ratings were measured in both babies and hymns. And the gossip? Oh, it was everywhere. There are ostraca pottery shards with casual writings where palace guards and workers jotted rumors about royal affairs, suspected infidelities, or mysterious illnesses. One even hints that a certain queen's perfume was too strong, as though she feared being forgotten. Poof, that's shade. You sit beneath a painted pillar showing Hatshepsut being breastfed by Hathor herself, a scene usually reserved for kings. That's how sacred she was. But remember, after her death, many of her images were erased, possibly because her power made her too sacred for the next regime to stomach. And sometimes sacredness masked very real scandal. Take the case of Nefertiti's daughters. They were depicted intimately close to Akhenaten. In some scenes, too intimately. Some fringe scholars have whispered about incest, cultic rituals, or at the very least, troubling iconography. We don't know the truth, but we know this. The divine family image got so tangled later, rulers tried to dismantle it entirely. That's the risk. When queens became symbols, their actions weren't just judged. They were interpreted, spun, censored, weaponized. A flirtatious glance might be read as seduction. A long absence from public view might imply disgrace. A too early death may be poison, maybe divine punishment, or maybe just bad luck spun into legend. Historians still argue whether queens genuinely believed their sacred status or just leaned into the role because it was safer than being seen as merely human. And you wonder what it felt like to be worshipped on Sunday and whispered about by Thursday. You step into a chapel lined with statues of the goddess Mut. Some queens took her name. Mut meant mother vulture, goddess, divine protector. But Mut was also terrifying. She was invoked in curses, in dreams, in spells meant to break enemies. One prayer reads, "O Mut, strip her voice, cloud her name. Let her be seen, but not spoken." Maybe that was a rival queen's plea. Maybe it worked. And maybe, just maybe, it describes every woman who came too close to power. As you leave the chapel, your fingers trail along a low wall. Carved into it is a small scene, two women kneeling beside a sistrum. One is dressed richly, the other plainly. The caption, "She sings to please the gods. She sings to survive." In this world, the sacred and the scandalous were always two notes in the same song. And queens, they learned how to sing it in perfect harmony. You turn from the temples and their layered meanings, following a winding stone path that narrows as it descends. The air here is thick with dust and secrets. You pass weathered columns and carved cobras before the corridor opens into a long, torch-lit hall, lined with painted scenes, births, burials, coronations, and whispers. Because what comes next isn't found on any monument. It's hidden in rumors, alternate inscriptions, and the quiet truth behind royal smiles. You've reached the realm of the hidden heirs. In ancient Egypt, succession was meant to be divine, predictable, written in the stars, or at least in the tomb walls. But the reality far more complicated. Power didn't always pass cleanly, and royal women, they often held the threads of who the next pharaoh would be and whether he'd survive his own coronation. Let's begin with the word you'll hear a lot in this space: lineage. It sounds noble, it's not. It's political. You pause before a stela showing a royal woman holding a child. She's smiling. The child isn't named. The caption is vague: son of the king's great wife. Which king, which wife? Historians still argue. Some names were deliberately omitted to allow future adjustments. In other words, a placeholder heir. Egyptian royal families often had multiple wives, and each queen naturally wanted her own son to inherit. This led to quiet tension, open manipulation, and the use of every tool at their disposal, alliances with priests, land grants to temples, flattery to scribes, and more than a few well-timed funerals. Consider Mutnejmet, sister of Nefertiti, and possibly married to Horemheb, the general who became pharaoh after the Amarna chaos. There are suggestions she may have birthed a royal child who died young, but no confirmed tomb for that child has ever been found. Still, Horemheb had no surviving heir. Coincidence, maybe. Or maybe someone else's child was removed from the equation. Here's a quirky detail: some royal women would name their children with parts of the reigning pharaoh's name as a subtle claim to legitimacy. It was like embedding your resume into your baby. You now enter a chamber where statues of scribes sit cross-legged, frozen in stone. These men wrote the records, kept the archives, confirmed paternity. A queen could win or lose everything depending on how they wrote a name, or how they didn't. Sometimes children were hidden not because they were unwanted, but because they were too dangerous to be seen. Take the example of Amenemhat III, a Middle Kingdom pharaoh known for massive building projects and a stable reign. But in later inscriptions, there are references to a royal son who vanished and to a daughter whose lineage was never clarified. Fringe theories suggest a quiet coup, a reshuffling of the dynastic tree, perhaps to protect a child or erase one. You pass a wall painting where a young boy stands behind a throne, not seated in it, not named, just there. An audience member or an heir in training not yet acknowledged. In some periods, succession didn't go to the oldest son, but the most politically convenient one. That meant queens had to play long games, grooming allies, forging temple partnerships, even adopting powerful daughters into the priesthood to secure influence. Because if your son couldn't rule, maybe your adopted heir could. And if that failed, you made sure the man who did become king owed you everything. Sometimes queens claimed divine conception for their sons, saying a moon had visited them in a dream and fathered the child. It sounds wild, but it worked. Especially if temple priests supported the claim. It made the child untouchable even if his paternity was questionable or inconvenient. You pause at a set of low shelves displaying amulets shaped like tiny swaddled babies. Some are labeled, others are not. These were often buried with royal women representing lost children, or perhaps ones whose identity was too politically dangerous to preserve. There's one tiny charm here worn smooth by time. The inscription reads, "For the one whose name was whispered but never spoken aloud." You exhale, because that says everything. And then the final twist. There were times when a queen didn't fight for a son, she fought for herself. If no suitable male heir existed, or none could be trusted, some royal women stepped in not as regents, but as rulers. Hatshepsut, Sobekneferu, possibly Nefertiti. They didn't raise heirs. They became the heir. It was bold, it was rare, and it was dangerous. But in those moments, they rewrote succession altogether. As you step from the chamber, the torchlight catches one final carving nearly invisible at first. It shows a woman holding a child in one arm and a scepter in the other. The caption, "She who gave birth to legacy and ruled while it grew." Sometimes the heir wasn't hidden. Sometimes she wore the crown herself. You walk now along a long, open corridor lined with breezy columns and sandstone benches. The Nile glitters in the near distance, and for the first time in a while, the air feels foreign, not hostile, just unfamiliar. Because tonight you step outside the gates of Egypt not to leave it behind, but to follow the royal women who crossed borders wearing Egyptian gold in lands where the rules were different, and so were the gods. This is the story of queens in foreign lands, daughters of the Nile sent far from Thebes or Memphis, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. They weren't just brides. They were ambassadors, political chess pieces, and cultural bridges with lives that shaped the world beyond Egypt's southern and eastern borders. You sit beneath a painted lintel depicting a procession, a young princess wrapped in translucent linen, stepping onto a foreign bark. Behind her, attendants carry dowries, perfumes, amulets, cloth, and papyrus scrolls. Ahead of her, a land she's never seen, and a husband she's never met. Let's start with one of the oldest examples, Princess Gilukhepa, daughter of the king of Mitanni. Around 1400 BCE, she was sent to Egypt to marry Amenhotep III, arriving with hundreds of attendants and a shipment of exotic animals and spices. She was young, possibly in her early teens. The journey would have taken months through desert river and caravan trail. And when she arrived, she entered a palace already full of wives. Chief among them was Queen Taye, who, let's be honest, was not interested in sharing the spotlight. So what happened to Gilukhepa? Officially, she became a secondary wife. Unofficially, her name disappears from Egyptian records not long after. Did she fade into the fabric of palace life? Was she sidelined? Or did she quietly build influence among the court's Mitanni connections? Historians still argue whether foreign brides ever truly assimilated into Egyptian culture or whether they simply learned to survive within it. You move toward a shaded courtyard where a different story plays out, the Hittite princess who almost became queen of Egypt. Remember her after Tutankhamun's sudden death. His widow, likely Ankhesenamun, wrote to the Hittite king requesting a son to marry. A shocking move. It would have placed a foreign-born prince on Egypt's throne. The Hittite king agreed. He sent his son Zananza, but the prince was murdered en route. We'll never know what kind of queen that Hittite bride might have become, whether she'd have ruled well, whether Egypt could have accepted her. But her story stands as a moment when a foreign royal woman almost rewrote Egyptian history. Here's a quirky twist. Egyptian princesses almost never married foreign rulers. The reasons were layered: political pride, religious purity, and the fear that sending a royal woman away weakened the divine bloodline. A daughter of Egypt once gone might birth rivals. But other cultures loved marrying Egyptian women. They brought not just beauty and status, but access to Egypt's spiritual legitimacy. You sit beneath a mural of Lady Bentresh, a semi-legendary foreign princess married into Egypt, and later said to have suffered possession by a demon. Pharaoh sent priests, gods were invoked, and her healing became the stuff of state myth. Real or not, the story shows the symbolic weight foreign queens carried. They weren't just wives. They were portals of diplomacy and divine narrative. And what of Egyptian queens who traveled themselves rare, but not unheard of? There's Cleopatra Selene, daughter of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony. After her mother's death, she was taken to Rome, then later married to King Juba II of Mauritania, modern-day Algeria. She became queen there, and she ruled. Coins show her in Egyptian style. Temples built under her influence fuse Egyptian and Berber iconography. She carried her mother's legacy far beyond the Nile and turned it into something hybrid, lasting strange. As you pass through an archway, a breeze brings the scent of foreign incense, frankincense from Punt Myrrh, from Nubia, spices from Byblos. The queens connected to these lands didn't just marry kings. Some were born of alliances raised between cultures, speaking multiple languages, trained in diplomacy before they reached puberty. And many of them never saw Egypt again. They were buried abroad. Statues of them stand with Egyptian wigs but foreign robes. Their names written in hieroglyphs next to Akkadian script or Hittite cuneiform. They weren't Egyptian enough for home, but they weren't foreign enough for where they landed. Still, they endured. like the unnamed princess buried near the Euphrates with a scarab reading. She lives in both lands. As the light dims, you feel their stories pressing in. Not ghosts, just echoes. Wives who became emissaries. Daughters who became symbols. Queens who carried the Nile in their bones, even as their footsteps trailed away from its banks. You descend again, this time into cool, dark silence. The flicker of torches gives way to the soft gleam of gold and the shimmer of polished stone. This isn't a temple, and it's not a palace. It's a tomb. But not just any tomb. This is the resting place of a queen, not remembered for who she married or what she ruled, but for how she prepared to die. You're about to explore the afterlife the royal women of Egypt built for themselves, layer by layer, amulet by amulet, word by word. Because in Egypt, death was just another throne. You're standing now at the threshold of the Valley of the Queens, a rocky gorge west of Thebes, sun-baked by day, star-drenched by night. It was here that royal wives, daughters, and mothers were buried in color-rich tombs carved into the cliffs, their walls covered in spells, songs, and gods. Let's begin with Nefertari's tomb, QV66. If the afterlife had a VIP suite, this would be it. The walls are dazzling deep reds, glowing yellows, the goddess Isis guiding Nefertari through the field of reeds, the queen shown reading aloud the spells herself. That's rare. That's powerful. She didn't need priests. She brought her own words. A quirky fact. Her tomb contains over 5,000 words of the Book of the Dead, but personalized, tailored to her journey, her fears, her glory. You move quietly past a depiction of her playing the Senate board, an ancient game of chance and fate. It wasn't just recreation. Senet symbolized the soul navigating the chaos of the afterlife. If she played well in life, she believed she could win eternal peace. Now here's something haunting. Many royal women did not receive such luxury. Some tombs were simple, undecorated. Some were reused, their names scratched out, their goods stolen. Not out of neglect, but often out of politics. A fallen dynasty meant lost tomb funding. A queen married to the wrong pharaoh. Her burial could be downgraded or denied. Historians still argue whether certain anonymous burials in the Valley of the Kings belonged to women who ruled briefly, but whose legacies were deliberately buried. Some may have even been moved, posthumously relocated by their successors in acts of quiet revenge or embarrassment. You walk into a different tomb, now smaller, but no less poignant. Inside lies a painted image of a queen standing between Hathor and Nut, one goddess offering wine, the other offering stars. The queen wears a diadem of feathers. Her face is serene, but her name gone, erased from the wall. The cartouche chiseled out with precision. Someone wanted her forgotten. And yet she's still here. Because death in Egypt wasn't about physical decay. It was about name. To speak someone's name was to keep them alive. That's why queens commissioned statues, hymns, temple donations. Even scarabs engraved with their names were left in tombs, so that long after flesh had vanished, the name would rise with the dawn. You find a basket of such scarabs in a sealed alcove. One reads, "Lady of Life, she who guides the horizon." Her name is cracked beyond reading, but her title remains. Her identity blurred, her dignity intact. You move toward a sarcophagus made of red quartzite etched with protective spells. The corners are guarded by the four goddesses of the canopic jars, Isis, Nephthys, Nith, and Serket. They don't just protect her organs, they protect her memory. A fringe theory. Some Egyptologists believe that in later periods certain royal women had their coffins built before they died, with their names left blank, waiting for the politics to settle, for their status to be secure. That way they wouldn't be buried as nobodies if their husbands fell from power. Smart and chilling. Now let's talk mummification. You pass a display of embalming tools, razors, resin ladles, linen rolls, natron blocks. Queens were mummified with the same care as kings, often placed in nested coffins, 3, 4, even 5 deep. Inside each coffin, more inscriptions, more spells. Because in Egypt, death wasn't rest. It was work, a journey, a process, a test. And queens prepared for it with the same intensity they brought to the throne. As you step back out into the night, you glance over the valley. The stars are low and clear, as if each one belonged to a queen watching from beyond. You imagine them, some celebrated, others forgotten, but all preserved in linen memory. And now, in you. Their bodies are still, but their stories still moving. The sun is rising faint and golden over the Nile's horizon. You squint up at the temple walls, now glowing amber, not from torchlight, but from the first fingers of dawn. You've been walking for hours, but it feels like no time at all. That's the magic of stories, soaked in stone and starlight. But now you pause at something different. Not a tomb, not a palace. A temple facade carved with myths and women. Tall women, divine women. Some with crowns shaped like thrones. Others with suns and cobras. Each one stares down at you with that ageless, unreadable gaze. These are Egypt's goddesses, and more importantly, the royal women who dared to become them. Because Egypt didn't just crown queens, it worshipped them. Take Isis, queen of the gods, sister and wife to Osiris. She was the archetype of the perfect royal woman, loyal, clever, healing, magical, maternal, vengeful when wronged. Every queen from the Middle Kingdom onward tried, at least in public, to look like her, act like her, be her. When Hatshepsut commissioned her temples, she had herself carved in poses identical to Isis. Same stance, same scepter, same side glance. She wasn't imitating, she was inhabiting. A quirky detail, some royal women added their own subtle touches. One priestess queen insisted her statues of Isis be painted with a faint mole above the lip matching her own. Now look over to Hathor, goddess of music, joy, fertility, patroness of love and women's health. You find her face on dozens of pillars, soft, cow-eared, mysterious. But beneath that smile, a protector, a wrathful lioness when needed. Queens turn to Hathor for strength when diplomacy failed. There are temple hymns where queens plead to become Hathor's mirror, reflecting not only beauty, but blinding power. Historians still argue whether queens actually believed they became divine after death, or whether it was all royal PR. But either way, the effect was lasting. In the temple of Medinet Habu, a queen is shown being nursed at the breast of Hathor, not as a child, but as an adult woman. Intimate, sacred, bold. You turn a corner and enter a sanctum. Here, incense still lingers. The walls are crowded with offerings, bread, wine, perfume, lotus, and names. Dozens of women's names, carved, painted, praised. These weren't goddesses, they were humans. Yet here they are in the company of gods. You pause at one name, Karamama, a little-known but powerful god's wife of Amun. Her statues gleam with electrum, her arms open in benediction. Her title, she who opens the mouths of the dead, heavy stuff. She didn't just pray for the deceased, she commanded their voices to rise. That's the level of influence royal women could reach when faith met politics. As priestess queens, they controlled rituals, temple wealth, and even ceremonial access to the gods. When pharaohs were away or weak, these women could speak on behalf of Egypt. A fringe theory. Some scholars believe a few temples were secretly maintained by all-female religious orders, with queens at the helm, not just as symbols, but as actual administrators, performers, and prophets. You reach out, and touch a wall, carving a queen seated between Isis and Ma'at, the goddess of truth. In her hand is a feather, not jewelry, not a dagger, a feather. Because in death every soul was weighed against Ma'at's feather, too heavy with sin devoured, lighter than truth, eternal peace. And here a queen holds it, not awaiting judgment, but defining it. The implication: royal women weren't just models of virtue. They were measures of it. You step outside, sunlight warm now on your face. The wind carries temple chants, long faded but somehow echoing. What the gods saw was women rising, crowned and barefoot, inked in scrolls and remembered in stone, mortal and divine. And now you've seen it too. The streets of Thebes are quiet now. You walk slower, sandals dragging just a little on the sun-warmed stone. The journey's been long, but in that soft stillness, something tugs at your sleeve, one final thread. And it leads not to a queen on a throne or a goddess in a temple, but to a girl, a daughter, a whisper between dynasties. Because Egypt's royal women weren't just powerhouses and priestesses, they were also children and waiting mothers and mourning voices in the shadows. Tonight you meet the ones history nearly forgot. You arrive at a narrow courtyard, once the private school for royal daughters. The walls are painted not with battles or gods, but with games, songs, even grammar drills. Queens in training learned more than etiquette. They studied astronomy, math, theology, and diplomacy. One name lingers here: Bekhetaten, daughter of Tiye, and likely sister to Akhenaten. She shows up in artwork as a small girl, always near her mother, never married, never crowned. But her placement is telling. At the side of one of Egypt's most powerful queens in scenes with foreign emissaries and temple processions. Was she a favorite, a failed heir, or perhaps a silent advisor whose role was erased? Historians still argue whether Bekhetaten died young or simply faded from record due to political shifts. One fringe theory suggests she was quietly appointed high priestess of Aten under a different name in the Amarna years. A religious ghost. You keep walking. Now a different voice whispers. Meritaten, daughter of Nefertiti, shown in temples beside her father, Akhenaten, later married to Pharaoh Smenkhkare, perhaps even ruling as a female pharaoh herself for a brief turbulent time. But her name gets tangled. In some records she vanishes. In others she reappears under new titles: Anket Keperure Neferuaten. Did she rule? Did she rebel? Did she survive? You pass a crumbling colonnade where faint traces of her name are scratched out, deliberately erased. A royal daughter ascending too far, or a queen caught in theological crossfire. A quirky detail: one ostracon fragment found in a workman's village contains a poem unfinished, possibly written about her. She came like dawn and vanished like mist. The sun wept. Even in fragments, her memory lingers. And so does that of Sitamun, daughter of Tiye, who became her own father's consort, a role that was ceremonial but also strategic. By marrying her daughter, Amenhotep III may have been reinforcing his divine status. But Sitamun wasn't just symbolic. She was given land titles, her own palace wing. She held real weight. Yet no tomb has ever been found for her. Just echoes. Now you arrive at a mural of women weaving linen, not servants, but princesses. Weaving was sacred. It connected the living to the dead, the mundane to the divine. Some royal daughters oversaw entire weaving workshops for temple offerings. Thread by thread, they stitched their place into the eternal. You glance at one final carving. A group of girls at play, balancing on one foot, tossing ivory balls, singing to a goddess you've never heard of. No crowns, no gold, just laughter in stone. It hits different, because even the greatest queens began somewhere. with dusty toes and ink-stained fingers whispering spells under their breath, watching the stars and dreaming not of thrones, but of being remembered. And tonight, you did that for them. You saw, you listened, you remembered. You're standing at the edge now, not of a tomb or temple, but something quieter, something softer. It's the hush before memory fades, the moment the past exhales and lets go. But you're still here. So let's take this last step gently. You descend a staircase carved into limestone. The air cools, walls narrow. Your torch flickers, casting shadows of figures, some crowned, some cloaked, some so faint they seem to breathe only when you blink. This is the Hall of Forgotten Queens. It's not on any map. It's not open to tourists. But it exists in every misfiled scroll, every shattered statue, every cartouche chiseled out by a rival dynasty. Here lie the women who ruled in silence, who mothered kings but died unnamed, who kept borders, calmed rebellions, held power through wedding rings, prayer beads, and steel nerves. One name fades across the wall, Kenemet Neferhedjet. It means united with the white crown. But which woman it refers to is unclear. There were several. All queens, all veiled in anonymity. You run your hand along a cracked relief. A woman rides a bark across the night sky, arms outstretched. Her title reads, Great One of the Horizon. But again, no name. Just the stars above her still shining. Historians still argue whether these erasures were political or accidental or both. In dynasties where names meant eternity, silence was a second death. But some survive anyway. In a recipe for perfume found in a tomb's antechamber, in the angle of a wig on a tiny statue, in the way future queens mimicked a certain headdress or prayer posture long after the name behind it was lost. That's legacy. Not loud, not always golden, but stitched into time like the lining of a royal robe. And now it's stitched into you. You step outside. The Nile is quiet. The stars are blinking out. Somewhere a bird cries, once then hushes, and you remember the scent of lotus, the scratch of linen, the rhythm of footfalls in palace corridors long turned to dust. The queens of Egypt walked here, and so did you. So now, we let it go. The torches dim. The stone cools beneath your feet. And the echoes of sandal steps, of prayers in forgotten dialects of laughter behind silk veils, they all begin to soften into the dark. You did it. You made it through the myths and masks, the gold and granite, the bloodline politics, and the quiet power plays. And most of all, you listened. To the girls who became queens, to the queens who became gods, to the gods who were once just daughters waiting for someone to speak their names again. Let the Nile fade now. Let the temples recede behind a golden mist. Let the papyrus scroll curl closed one last time. Breathe in slowly, like the breeze that passed through the columns of Karnak after the last worshipper left. Breathe out softer, like sand brushing over a name half buried, half remembered. You're safe now. You're warm. You're not alone. Because stories, especially the ones left behind, find us for a reason. And tonight, you answered. Sleep well, Queen Whisperer. End of script. Sweet dreams.